I have a bit of a cold, so bear with me. I've been a student and working as the faculty for almost 5 years now here, and I just can't resist. So here it goes. Welcome to SCI-Arc.
Put your glasses on.
Good evening. Recently, there has been a resurgence of computational design approaches at SCI-Arc and in the architectural world in general. Now, this has been a slow process, making the transition from talking about algorithmic design to actually working with algorithmic approaches. We'll take this semester, for example. SCI-Arc has brought in a specialized group of computational designers. Roland Snooks, a talented programmer and principal of the firm Kokogia, is teaching a seminar on swarm intelligence, of which I was lucky enough to sit on a review last week. And also Marcos Novak, which I think he's here, I'm not sure, but he is conducting the World Makers class, which is using all measures of algorithmic and interactive devices. And also I'm conducting a generative scripting workshop, which coincidentally ends today, and we're showcasing some work near that gallery, so feel free after the lecture to stop by. Now, these classes by Roland, Marcos, and I could be interpreted as the crest of a long-awaited tsunami of programming culture that is flooding the school. And, and guess who comes surfing in on this wave with what appears to trivialize and affirm every skeptic's opinion of our instruction with the unfortunate title, Embrace Your One-Trick Pony. Our speaker, Robert Hodgin. But however, and this is really important, that would be a myopic and hasty assumption to read a lecture by its title, especially if the speaker is as brilliant as Mr. Hodgin. Mr. Hodgin received his BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1998, and it was a degree in sculpture. He's co-founder and executive creative director of the Barbarian Group, based in San Francisco, where he focuses on some of the most groundbreaking Flash and interactive concepts to hit the web. His early work caught the attention of Macromedia, where he contributed to the development of Flash 5. Also, he's conducted several lectures and participated in symposia on his experimental approaches across the world in the EU, United States. He's most well known for his revolutionary visualization work, his processing work on this website, flight404.com, of which he will likely be speaking tonight. He has won some of the highest design honors for both his work at the Barbarian Group and at Flight 404. Notable prizes are the Grand Clio, several gold and silver pencils, several Hatch Awards, the New England Web Design Awards, Massachusetts Interactive Media Council Awards, and 5 Macromedia Sites of the Day. His work expresses an unparalleled exuberance in the virtual and in the real world, which can hardly be summed up with the title, Embrace Your One-Trick Pony. Please welcome Robert Hodgin.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here at SCI-Arc. As he mentioned, I went to school at Rhode Island School of Design, and that was where I sort of learned to dislike architecture students. And not for anything that you've done to me personally, but when I arrived at RISD, I thought I want to be a painter. And then, freshman orientation, you take some classes and you realize there's a lot more out there than what you thought you wanted to study when you went to school. So I was exposed to industrial design and glass blowing and illustration, and I developed a bit of a fondness for the architecture program. So I would spend some time just walking around the studios because there was something about the architects there. They all seemed, I don't know, focused. Everybody else seemed confused. But then I noticed that most of the architecture students also had a cot at their desk. And and they work a lot harder than I ever wanted to. So architecture was out. I didn't want to do a 5-year program, and I didn't want to sleep in my space. So I settled on sculpture. I figured if I really wanted to, I could create buildings and call it art, and get a poor crit, but at least I could get it out of my system. And so while at RISD in the sculpture department, I started to learn a little bit more about computers, starting with picking up Photoshop, and then eventually moving on to teaching myself how to use Flash, because I needed to pay back those school loans somehow. And from there I never really looked back. In 2001, 4 friends and I started up the Barbarian Group, and we were initially a sort of a flash house. We were known for our flash work, and over the last 6 years, we've continued to sort of refine our skill sets and take on some really fantastic co-workers, and so now we're starting to branch out a bit. I moved to San Francisco a couple years ago and opened up the San Francisco office, and the focus for the San Francisco office is to be more of a lab space, more experimental, and to try to create content for people that can be viewed in ways other than just looking at a website in a browser. So I'm going to show some of the pieces that I've created while at the Barbarian Group, and I'll show some personal work as well. Let's see if I can shift a bit. All right, so yeah, ponies. I'm actually surprised anybody showed up. There's a picture of me with a cat on my shoulder on the website, and there's ponies in the title. I saw that I made the home and garden section of the LA Times. That was very exciting. So what I mean by embracing your inner one-trick ponies is that there seems to be some sort of stigma associated with abusing an idea, and that's something that I've gotten very good at. And I find it useful to not constantly look for the next new thing, but to continue to explore things that you have a fascination with. There's no reason to move on because maybe other people think that you're spending too much time working with, Perlin noise, as I probably do. But I find it really satisfying to explore an idea as fully as I can and to keep revisiting it, because you eventually developed a closeness to these ideas, and you can find new and interesting ways to use them that maybe others haven't yet. So these are my 5 main tricks, and I'm going to show how I've used them in a few different projects that I'm going to be talking about. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Wired Next Fest project, which was our first sort of nice experimental client job through the Barbarian Group. We were approached by an advertising agency in San Francisco to help them come up with an interactive wall to be shown at Next Fest, which is like a technology conference that Wired magazine sponsors. In this case, it was in New York City a couple Septembers ago. And the direct client was Saturn Automobiles, and they were showcasing a new line of hybrid vehicles. And this convention center space is really hectic because everybody's sort of pushed up against each other, and they're all trying to get your attention by showing you the weird robots or musical instruments that are driven by pneumatic arms. And, it's pretty chaotic if you've ever gone. So the Saturn space, they were trying to create something that was a little more serene, something that you could escape to. And so we were in charge of developing this wall that you see in the background here. The initial concept was that it should just be an interactive wall of grass, and that was all that they left us with. They did want there to be some sort of interaction between the viewer and the screen, as well as this type element, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the setup was fairly complicated. Luckily, we had the help of a projection house that was whose sort of focus is to help set up these projection systems. So all of this was accessed through virtual desktop of the server, where we had a an application that was made with processing. Hopefully you know what processing is by now. It's a really exciting open source program. It's basically a Java compiler, but it's geared towards people who aren't strong coders. I never even learned how to code HTML. The first coding language I ever learned was ActionScript in Flash, and then from there I moved on to processing, and it was a pretty easy leap for me because the two languages aren't that dissimilar. So it was a processing application that sends this very large image to this video processor, which will then split it to run on 4 different projectors that project overlapping images onto this 45 by 12 foot rear projection screen. Behind the viewers is an infrared security camera that is analyzing the positions of the people that are standing in front of the screen, so we could then use that data to influence the visuals. And we also had a couple kiosks where people could type in messages that would appear live on screen. They're supposed to answer the question, how would the world be a better place if everybody drove hybrids? But most people just used it as an opportunity to see what curse words they could get up on screen. So we implemented human swear filtering because people are clever. They're going to find ways around your swear filters. So we actually had a job rec for someone who would sit sort of behind the scenes for 2 days straight and make sure that nobody said anything too inappropriate. He was a PhD in political science. So here's a short video of the piece working. This is Ashley, who helped set up the kiosks. And Teamster. So that's how it looked when it was installed. I'm going to run a processing application. I sort of revisited the problem a few months later because I wanted to see what I could get away with some of my recently developed coding skills. I like to go back to these ideas just to see how much I can improve them, or I don't know, see if there's any new tangents worth exploring. So I just decided to make a more three-dimensional immersive version. It's still responding to webcam input. Give you a better idea of what it is you're looking at. Pull back the camera and turn off the unnecessary background. I think I have a flash. Let's see this. So, not really. The camera in my laptop is picking up differences in brightness, and then is using that input to influence how much the grass bends. And if I turn off that feature, you can see this sort of really subtle breeze blowing over the entire scene, and that's this thing called Perlin noise, which I always have a hard time explaining, so I usually just stop trying. But it's essentially a random number generator, but it'll give you a nice smoothing changing set of random numbers. Whereas white noise will just give you this, this crazy mess of white and black. Perlin noise will give you really smooth changes in between those whites and blacks. So if you then animate that information, in this case, from left to right, you can use that to influence how much the grass blades bend. You can get a really nice wind effect, because we wanted the piece to draw the viewer in, even if there were no people standing in front of it interacting with it. So if you turn that off, you can just see the simple blades of grass. It's a bunch of key commands. There we go. So that's a better look at the Perlin noise wind. It's just this really nice, smoothly changing color field, and I use that color data to influence how much each blade bends. So if I turn the webcam input back on, you can see that the webcam influence can have an impact on how much this sheet of white ripples. And then if you turn the blades back on, these buttons. So as as a spot on the plane gets brighter white, the grass will bend more to the left. As it gets darker, it'll bend to the right. And there's also this underlying ripple so that you get this nice sort of undulating mass of grass blades. Fox horror. This was a fun project to work on. A friend of mine had started a motion graphics shop in Portland called Nervo, and he was familiar with some of the flocking studies that I had posted on Flickr and wanted me to help him do some motion graphics work using these flocking algorithms. So we knew that the deadline was too short to actually do much back and forth, so I didn't want to have to render out some flocking movements and then send it to him for him to approve, only to find out he wants me to tweak something, send it back, and then I'll re-render. So we decided to just deliver him an application that would allow him to customize how these birds would behave in a 3D space. When he sees some movement that he likes, he can then just start saving out that image data. So he has complete control over the final look. So this is one of the early test renders. So this uses Perlin noise. It's that same smoothly changing set of numbers, but if you use it to tell each bird object which direction to fly, then you can get some really nice flocking. I just pressed a key command. I don't know what it does. So for all of those, he provided us with the 3D assets. He had one of his coworkers export out a series of stills of a crow in a flap cycle, and he gave me 10 different angles of viewing this crow. They're all from sort of eye level. There aren't any views of you looking down onto the crow or looking up at it. So using these 160 images, I ended up faking a fairly believable 3D flocking with, just by choosing the right image depending on which direction the object is moving. So this is the application we delivered him. It has a lot of toggles where you can adjust whether or not there's collision detection. You can turn the tethered strings off. You can move the camera about. If you really wanted to get crazy, you can just keep adding birds. If he sees something that he likes, he just hits the save key, and it'll start saving out high-res stills. So this was how we made all the content for those 2 bumps. Oops. So it was an interesting way of working with him because we put a lot of the control back into his hands. So we just gave him a really nice engine, and then he figured out what he needed to do with it. It's a process that we've used a couple times since. It's just a lot easier giving people applications because sometimes they don't know exactly what they want, and this way they can figure it out on their own time. So while doing that piece, I made this render. I was trying to get the tethered strings to work well, and I ended up with this slightly pretty effect where it looks like they're depositing a string onto a surface. And so I wanted to explore that idea further because I liked thinking about what these crows would draw if they had access to opposable thumbs and spray paint cans. So, I mean, why not, right? So this was one of the early tests where I'm actually paying attention to where the objects are over the ground plane, and they're able to drag this string, which will then sort of etch ink directly onto this this surface, and this is the resulting print that came from that piece. So I started to get a little more creative with the controls and adding some extra elements just to see what the drawings would look like. And this is a recurring theme in my work. I like setting up a system and then just stepping away from it, because often I end up being really surprised by the result. And so, you know, you've got a few hundred objects here, these ribbon objects, and they're able to sort of rain like a mist of ink onto this paper. But if ever they touch the paper, they scrape that ink away. So it's a, you know, constant additive and subtractive process. And here's a still from that particular render. And these are, you know, print resolution, so I made a couple really nice prints from this series. And here's a detail shot. So this is Shirley. Sometime last year, I noticed that my cat was spending a lot of time at the kitchen window, and I looked and saw that this pigeon had made a nest in the neglected planter outside my kitchen window. You know, a few weeks later, I realized that there were also eggs there. And you know, they're so perfect. And then they hatch, and then there is nothing uglier than a pigeon baby, and that's probably why you've never seen them, because you would probably stomp them to death. They have these spikes that grow, well, that's neither here nor there. So I wanted to take the opportunity to exploit this pigeon that had landed in my planter, and on a whim decided that I wanted to do some camera tracking and camera analysis just to see what I could get away with. So I ended up, for every frame of video, I analyzed where there's the largest patch of gray, and then I look for the peak of that patch and then stick a fez on it. Hours of amusement. So here's a time-lapse video. You know, it wasn't perfect. Sometimes the hat would end up on the pigeon's butt, because that would be the highest point in the camera, but still amusing. So continuing with that idea of taking webcam, like a webcam input, and then messing with it, and then spitting it back out. So I mean, you could at any point during the Shirley's visit, you could go to a live webcam view of it and see where the fez is. So this is the view from the roof of my apartment building, lovely San Francisco. So I took the image and I cut it up into layers so I could get 5 different depths, because I wanted to be able to add content to this webcam, and you know, it's probably not very architecturally friendly, but this is what I ended up doing with it. So I mean, you can stick the content in between the layers of like masked out webcam, and you know, if you really wanted to, you could probably convince people that something very bad was happening nearby. But this is an idea I'm still exploring. I'm not sure where I want to go with it next, but I like the idea of it. I do love San Francisco, don't get me wrong. I don't actually like that one building, but that's okay. I mean, it's just a rectangle, boring. Magnetic structures. So the Barbarian Group has a partnership with a gallery in Seattle called the McLeod Residence, and they wanted us to help them with their exhibit on interactivity by having us do a couple pieces for them. And this piece I was really happy with. So I'd been doing these weird magnetism studies, and one of my coworkers, Andrew, and I decided we wanted to see what this would look like if we could actually use Maya as the rendering engine instead of processing. So for these, you know, these sets of objects, I would spit out the X, Y, and Z data and then hand it over to Andrew, who would then put it into Maya and do some crazy isosurface ambient occlusion rendering. And we ended up with these prints. We did a series of 7 prints because they have 7 permanently installed light boxes. So they were printed on Duratrans and lit from behind. And they really took on this nice this look of cut paper, or in this case, crumpled paper. And it was a nice process because I wouldn't have been able to create these results with processing, at least not very easily. But it was nice just to be able to hand the data off to somebody who was skilled with their particular tool, just to see what they would end up looking like. And the exhibit went well. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, a lot of people thought that these were actual paper sculptures that we photographed. I don't know why they thought we had this much time on our hands. And even even though we'd explained to them the process, I think in the back of their mind they're thinking, no, that's paper. And it's fine. Another piece that we did for that installation, it was done by Andrew Chandler and I. We wanted to explore creating butterfly wing patterns that were all done algorithmically. So here's one set of butterfly wings that are developed using a Voronoi algorithm. It's another Voronoi. This one's using flow lines. And here's a quick video to show how some of those were made. This was also done in processing, basically flooding each wing shape with a bunch of magnetic particles and just letting them settle into place, and then saving out that data, and then making a bunch of prints. The prints came out very nice, but the key was that Chandler convinced us that he would be able to make slightly mechanical versions of these. So we got some of the wings laser cut, and this is a SketchUp view of how the installation was going to end up looking. And here's a short video of it once it was installed. So there are 7 butterflies. Each one is trapped in its own little pedestal. And they're pinned to this board, and there are these really tiny rare earth magnets clipped onto each of the wings. And inside of the pedestal is a very strong magnet that's on a motor that is capable of rotating. When it rotates up, it pushes the magnets that are on the wings away. But since the wings are tacked to this surface, they end up flapping. So behind the viewers is a webcam that's determining where people are standing. So if somebody walks into the room, they'll just see 7 pedestals with the butterfly in each one. But as they get closer to see the detail on the butterfly wings, then the butterfly wings will take that opportunity to move. It was a difficult project. The installation finished with 6 minutes to spare, which seemed a little tight. Chandler pointed out that it was near perfect timing. I'm not sure I buy into that logic because we were pretty stressed for the majority of that day. But I think the thing that is most surprising about this project is we didn't know what it would look like once it started to work. And when it did start to work, it was a bit disturbing. Because the movement is not very fluid, it's not super organic, but it does look like they're struggling to get up from this pedestal. They really want to fly away, but we've stuck needles into them. So they're not going to be that vibrant with their movement. But because there are no mechanical pieces that are exposed, a lot of people didn't understand what they were looking at. They weren't sure why these things were moving. So it's an idea that hopefully we're going to revisit at some point. So I went back to revisit the magnetic piece that was sort of the offshoot of that flocking bird project, because I wanted to see what more I could do with it. So instead of just using Perlin noise, which I found was just giving me this look of like marbleized paper, and it wasn't, it was very obvious to me how it was made. I wanted to try to abstract it a bit more, so I started to use magnetism as the major force for these drawings. I would throw a bunch of magnetic particles into a space and let them move about and keep a running record of how these objects interact with the floor plane. And so these are some of the drawings that came out of that series. Now these are also analyzing audio because I wanted some sort of input that would have enough variety that I wouldn't be able to just code it up by hand. So I chose audio as my major input. All of these prints are showing a period of about 4 minutes as I analyze different songs. You can see sort of the sound waves captured in these little ribbon tendrils. And I have a process video here. Magnetosphere. A couple years ago, I was exposed to this stuff called ferromagnetic fluid. Well, it didn't infect me. I'm sure by now you've all seen it. It's pretty commonplace now. I've seen a few art installations using it, but it's a supersaturation of oil and magnetic particles, iron, metallic particles. So if you expose it to a magnetic field, then the oil starts to move in this really sort of surreal, almost disturbing way. Here's photos from an installation by Kodama, where I believe this sort of magnetic oil is responding to audio input. I'm not quite certain. I didn't see this piece in person, but I've ordered some of this fluid off the internet. It's not that expensive. And in playing with it, I was really struck by sort of the mathematical beauty of how these spikes arrange themselves, and I wanted to figure out how to how to control it somehow. And so I decided I wanted to learn how to code some sort of magnetic structures engine, because I really liked how these fields looked when you visualize them. So that was the challenge that I gave myself. Some random magnet sculptures. So in my research, I came across this scientific experiment where scientists were dropping little dots of ferromagnetic fluid onto a dish that was coated in some sort of oil. And they were surprised to see that if they sort of dropped these little blobs at a regular interval, they would self-organize into these really nice spirals. And so this was the starting point for my explorations. I wanted to find a way to code something that would behave like this, because if I could, then I felt like maybe I was making progress towards my ultimate goal. So I started with a simple dot, just a dot in space. Added a second one, and they pushed apart. I was very excited. I was well on my way. So the more dots I added, the more that they wanted to move away from the center, because these particles are all repelling each other. So I needed a way to confine them. So I started to add gravity to the equation. Like the center of the screen represents a gravitational pull. So you throw these dots in, they're trying to push away from each other, but they're all being drawn in towards the same center point, and they end up organizing themselves in a really nice, mathematically predictable way. So I continue to explore this code. Over the last 2 years, it's the trick that I go back to the most, because I'm endlessly fascinated by the way these particles react to each other in space, and it's generally something that I have a hard time coding up from scratch. So I create these simple rules. Each particle needs to push away from every other particle, but they all need to be pulled in towards these larger, these gravity orbs. And then I just like to sit back and see what happens. So this is one of the first stills from when I finally got it to work in a 3D environment. Then I started to add the notion of these ribbon trails, which basically just shows you the path that each particle traveled over time. And sometimes the look got simpler. In this case, it influenced a quilt my mother made. Magneto quilt. She won second place, unfortunately, not first. You can sort of see what won first. It's got a turkey. There's a rooster weather vane. I can see why that would win. So I started to add audio to the equation because I wanted to have these particles have a variable mass and charge, because I figured that would be an interesting way to sort of mix things up a bit so they don't just settle into perfect little spheres. I want them to sort of dance around. So audio became the primary influence for this series. Additive blending. So the look started to get fairly complex, but it's all still the same basic rules that I started with back at the beginning. I think next is a video. I did this sort of music video to a song by artist Trent Moeller, and posted it, and it did really well. I got a lot of hits. I had to buy server space at Amazon because I couldn't handle the traffic, and that sort of kicked things into high gear. I realized that other people liked looking at this as much as I did. So a few months ago, I revisited that original video. Same audio. It's a song called "Miss You," and again, it's I'm creating a system with very few simple rules, and then piping audio into it, and then I go to bed, and then the next morning I piece it all together, and sometimes the results are So this next piece, I actually have a sort of an interactive demo for. I'm going to show the demo after I talk about the piece a bit, but it's an extension of the last magnetosphere bit. I discovered subtractive blending at this point, and I wanted to find a way to give these scenes a little more depth, because if you're dealing with nothing but pinpoints of light, it's kind of hard to get any sense of scale. And so I wanted to put in sort of these larger, more opaque shapes into the mix, just to see if it would improve on how people perceive scale in these spaces. So this was some stills for the demo, which I made when I was giving a talk at UCLA a couple months ago. I wanted to be able to showcase the steps that went into making something like this. And in making that demo, I sort of had an idea for how to extend the music video of these pieces to make them, I don't know, a little more related to the music. So I started to incorporate the lyrics. I created an application that would allow me to analyze a piece of audio with a little more sort of manual input. Beat detection is actually quite hard, and there wasn't any good way for me to have really accurate beat detection without just doing it myself. So with this application, I could scrub through a piece of audio and then just manually enter in where the beats are. So in doing that, I started to wonder why I don't do that to lyrics as well. And so I extended the application to allow me to determine how long like a syllable is lasting. And so I code in all the syllables, and then I went and pulled the lyrics off the internet, and then piped the lyrics back into the piece as I'm analyzing it. So that way I can have the piece show what words are being sung at that specific time. Sort of bring it back a bit and show you these tricks up close. I use particle emitters a lot. This is a sort of a generic particle emitter. It exists to send these particles out into space. And the particles basically just pay attention to which direction they're moving, what size they are, and very little else at this stage. I'm sure you've all seen particle emitters before. Nothing special here, but I can then start to influence how the particles move. So, you know, I could throw in gravity, so now they're being pulled downwards. I could put in a Perlin noise influence, which would make them move in this more organic way, you know, a bit reminiscent of sparks, you know, popping off of a fire. But it's still, you know, still just a particle emitter. So I can, well, let's turn the gravity back on and add a floor plane. So now things are a little more interesting because I can see how these particles are reacting in sort of a more understandable space. There's a floor, and these particles will bounce off of it. But I want to do more with them, so I'm going to turn off their ability to age. So now they're just these dots. They don't have much life in them, but they can still be influenced. So I can turn the Perlin influence back on, and they'll sort of form these really nice rivers. But you know, if I leave that on for too long, they'll eventually, you know, trail off into the distance and never come back. So I need to find a way to keep them more engaged in this environment. So let me make us more. So I can add an orbital influence. So now they want to orbit around this emitter. But again, they tend to want to go away, and I want them to stick around so I can play with them. So, so I'll turn on magnetic attraction. So now the emitter is an attractor, so it's trying to draw these particles in towards its center. So now I've got, you know, a nice closed system. The particles are going to stick around because they're always being pulled in towards the center. What else? I can turn on their ribbon trails. Another one of the tricks. You know, very easy trick. Just a nice way of showing you how the particles are moving. Because I'm drawing, you know, a colored line from their current position to their, you know, their last 20 or 50, I don't remember how many here, positions, so that I can have a better idea of how they're moving through the space. Let me turn off gravity and turn off, I mean, see, this is what I do all day. I create these systems, and then I just start adding little bits, turning little bits on and off, and you know, seeing if the results are interesting. If so, I'll continue. If not, then I'll explore a tangent. So I want these particles to stick to this center sphere, so I'm going to turn on this thing I call sphere locking. So basically, if the particle hits the sphere, it will become stuck to it, and it can't leave sort of the shell of this sphere. See if I can't grab them all. So you can see now, you know, the result is fairly amusing. This is what led to that last Goldfrapp video. It's because I really liked the way this ended up looking, because it started to seem like I was creating sort of a star or a sun. Turn off the particles, turn off the corona and the nebula effect, and you end up with this sort of oddly texture map sphere. What happens if I add another? Particles back on. So now I'm adding a bunch of particles, which is going to slow things down quite a bit, but there's this one effect that I like to show. Okay, so I'm connecting particles that are close enough to each other. I can connect with a line. So you can start to create these more architectural elements. Turn off some of the background glow, and you get an idea of, well, I don't know how to turn that off. That wasn't it. Oh, I made a mess of it. But, this gives you an idea into my process. I really generally don't know what I'm doing, but I do know how to do little things, so I just keep doing these little things, and they start to add up, and you end up with things that you wouldn't have been able to create from scratch. At least I wouldn't have been able to. And that's how I go about making all these videos. And you know what? I will probably still be working with these tricks, 10 years from now, because every time I go back and revisit these pieces, I think of really interesting ways to extend them, ways that I didn't think about the year before. So I'm sure I'll continue to play with magnetism and Perlin noise because they're inexhaustibly amusing to me. Hopefully you as well. But, well, I think that's all I have.